Hello everybody, it's Grandmama again. Time for another story from a Hometown Scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. Pat Anderson. Hello there. It was just 40 years ago this week that Grays Harbor was saddened with the news that a pioneer leader and industrialist had died as a result of an accident in California. The man was H.N. Anderson Sr., a lumberman, a builder of great things, a man of vision, and a remarkable individualist. And around his untimely death and his remarkable capacity to look ahead has grown a story so strange and so rich in coincidence that it might have been fashioned from a purest fiction. But before I tell you about the accident that ended the remarkable career and the legend of this man's vision, let me tell you something about the man himself. He was known to all Grays Harbor, to big men and small, as Pat Anderson. He had been born in Altoona, Pennsylvania in 1839, and in 1878, with lumbering beckoning a growing industry in Michigan, he moved to the town of Greensville in that state. There he spent 20 years in the lumber business. When J.M. Weatherwax, the pioneer Grays Harbor sawmill operator, died in 1898, Pat Anderson bought his mill from the estate and began operation of a plant that we know today as the Anderson Middleton Lumber Company at the foot of Broadway in Aberdeen. With his three sons, Sam, Hal, and Ed, and with his son-in-law, Bert Middleton, he began to build a lumbering organization that projected far into the future. And as he built, the roots of the Anderson and Middleton family became firmly enmeshed in Grays Harbor soil, and their lives an important part of the early life of the community. And then, when he had operated the local mill for a few years, Pat Anderson got a glimpse of the future of the timber industry on the West Coast. He made a trip into the redwoods of Northern California, and an idea was born. That's the story I want to read tonight from our Hometown Scrapbook. But first, a few words from Dick Crombie and our sponsors. What Pat Anderson saw in the redwoods of northwestern California, other men were to see later. But when he saw the huge stands of fine timber just after the turn of the 20th century, he decided that there lay the opportunities for a lumberman. He began to investigate the possibilities. The timber was easily obtained by purchase, but there were no problems on how to get it, how to cut it, and where, and how to move it out to the coast, where his workmen would live, and countless others. But as he pushed his investigation further, a vast and complete scheme seemed to work itself out. A mill located about 12 miles in from the coast could cut lumber. It could be moved over the rail line to the docks and shipped both north and south. He could select an area where the soil was tillable and locate his workmen's home along the rail lines, giving them access to the mill by the company train. They could have orchards, gardens of their own town. He envisioned more than an industry. He saw a way of life. The great redwood forest made it practical. The mild climate made it desirable. It was both a business opportunity and a social experiment. With the enthusiasm that characterized this remarkable man, he struck forward, selecting an area near what is now Gerberville, California, for his great venture. He began his plan. The Southern Pacific survey of its North Sound Railroad lay along the coast through the exact region to which he had located. Someday, he thought, this will all be connected by rail lines. He located the mill on a small stream a dozen miles in from the coast and constructed a dam to form a mill pond. He laid out the railroad to connect the mill and the small coastal ports, Bear Harbor, and workmen began to building of 14 enormous trestles required to span the narrow valleys of the coastal strip. As the construction of the mill began, Pap Anderson roamed through the valleys along his rail lines, selecting suitable sites for those who would one day turn the wheels of his new mill. He selected them. He set others to work planting orchards for them. Peaches, apples, and cherries were selected with great care for variety and planted through the valleys in profusion. And as the workmen moved with the completion of the rail line to the coast, crews went to work on cottages and houses that would soon be occupied by families of his workmen. Down at the ocean, at Bear Harbor, another construction crew drove pilings for the new docks and planned a tram loading system where the ships of lumber fleet would dock. And for the ships, he made arrangements with the Pollard Steamship Company of San Francisco. They would furnish a trio of steam schooners, the Newburgh, the Chehalis, and the Concordia. Do you recognize those as three of the steam schooners who we talked about in earlier chapters of the scrapbook? A town was laid out and work was started on the building. It was to be Andersonia, 8 miles from Garberville. It would have a general store, a post office, and in fact all the essentials of a full-grown lumber town. When the locomotives came for the railroad, they were unloaded at the new dock and slipped onto their carriages. Puffing under their own steam, they climbed the 12 miles to the mill and were housed in the shops and roundhouse built for them. Flat cars to carry the lumber and logs were assembled, and for a time they moved back and forth from the coast to the mill, carrying the machinery for the new plant. And as the construction progressed, Pap Anderson began to assemble his crew. Some went down from Grays Harbor and other lumber communities of the Northwest, but some he brought out from his old home in Michigan. One who made the trip was his foreman, Mr. Lilly, who stood open-mouthed before the biggest trees he had ever seen. As the crews came on the job, some were put to work installing machinery, and others went into the woods and began to cut the giant redwoods to fill the mill pond. By the time the mill was ready for operation, more than 2 million feet of redwood logs were barked and floating in the pond behind the dam. And then one day, in the fall of 1905, the whole vast project was ready for the test. Pap Anderson's son, S.M. Anderson, and Bert Middleton had made the trip down the coast to Bear Harbor and had journeyed over the new railroad to the mill for the opening. They found the town of Andersonia draped with a bright-colored bunting and homes filled with workmen's families, the great vision at last a reality. And then on the last day of October, Pap Anderson announced that they would cut the first log. It had been a race against time to have everything ready, and much of the scaffolding and staging was still up around the newly constructed sawmill. But the crew was ready, and the saw had lined up, and the carriage tested, and live rolls were working. And Pap said, "Start her up!" There was a crowd on hand the morning of the first cut, and as the first big redwood log came up the slip, dripping and heavy with flawless wood, Pap Anderson took the position behind the saw where he could watch the details of every second of its operation. His eyes sparkled as the big log rolled onto the cold deck and slid onto the carriage. Then slowly the carriage rolled forward and the saws bit deep into the rich timber, the red-brown sawdust flying in a spray of dust behind the cut. The slab dropped free onto the live rolls. The off-bearer sunk his pick-run into the slab and lined it up on the rolls as it started through the mill. At that moment, as though fate had plotted it as part of an amazing display, a cable being used to demolish the staging from the construction work caught on a brace in the structure of the mill. It tore the brace loose, and it tumbled down from the high overhead directly onto the one man whose vision had the great enough to see it all. It struck Pap Anderson down where he stood. Although everything was done that could be done, Pap Anderson lingered for a hopeless week and then died. And in the redwood empire that he built, all things stopped. The mill silent for a moment, the big timber had tumbled out of the roof to strike down its builder remained silent. On the carriage, a log with a single slab cut from it gathered cobwebs. For a time, the sons considered assuming command of the great operation and put the mill to work, but it was far too much away. They put their roots down in Grays Harbor. Their homes were here, their families growing up here. They thought of placing it in competent hands for operation. But the hard times of 1907 had already shaken the lumber market. The San Francisco earthquake had voided the Southern Pacific Railroad surveys, and that line changed its mind and were made new surveys and came inland. The office and general stores were closed. The workers drifted away to new jobs and new homes. In the mill, the pipes were drained and the fires put out. Tools were left where they lay, and the locomotives were run into the roundhouses and abandoned. The great dream was over, with the loss of its dreamer. Occasionally, the sons would discuss the feasibility of reopening the mill, but as years went on, it became almost forgotten. Time, as it must to all men, brought its change. One by one, Pap's sons dropped out of active sawmilling and passed on. His grandsons were now making sawdust, but all in the Northwest, and so 40 years passed. And with the end of the 40 years came the end of World War II. Back from World War II came Sam Jr., grandson of Pap Anderson, with his brothers Hal and Reg. His cast about for a new place to begin. Then someone suggested Andersonia. They visited the Great Dream with the idea of possibly restoring the plant to operation. And there in the midst of the new redwood forest stood the mill, the buildings, the houses, and down from the town to Bear Harbor, across the trestles falling in decay, wound a fabulous railroad. Between the ties of the railroad track, redwoods had grown 2 feet in diameter. Up through the sheds, the railroads had pushed their way. Railroad cars were lifted into the air by sprouting redwoods that grew right through them. On the carriage in the mill, the great redwood log seemed anchored with a slab cut from it. The dam had broken loose and a pond filled with logs to wash down the river. It had also undermined the foundation of the mill, but except for that, the 40-year-old plant seemed ready to operate. Its engines were still covered with a light film of oil. The belts were still taut and strong. The boilers sounded, and the live rolls were as good as the day they were installed. Faded bunting still decorated the general store and the offices, but the boards of the buildings were weathered gray with many seasons. The orchard planted by old Pap for his workers and their families were long since mature and grew wildly in the dense struggle to stay alive amongst the redwoods. Luscious ripe peaches dangled from some limbs as they made their inspection. In the roundhouse, the locomotives stood silently where they had waited for 40 years, and that day they decided to recapture that dream that was Pap Anderson's. Not exactly as he envisioned it, but with modern variations. I'll tell you about how they did it right after we hear a few words from Dick Crombie and our sponsors. Yes, it was just after the late war that the grandsons of old Pap Anderson started production in the mill that had been laid idle for 40 years before. Salvaging most of the machinery and much of the structure, they got the plant into operation and began cutting the giants that had escaped the woodman's axe by a strange trick of fate. Timber cruisers called it the finest stand of redwood in California, with redwood trees big enough to harvest, grown to their size for shedding in only a few years. While they were putting the plant in order, they lived in the big house on the hill that Pap Anderson had built for himself and had occupied a few days before the tragic accident that ended his life. And today the saws sing in the thick redwood as the big logs go through the new mill. Not quite as Pap Anderson dreamed it when the 20th century was new, but as a modern sawmill is done, in the shadow of a venture that was planned and executed with care and faith of a man realizing a great dream a dream with an endearing that O. Henry could not have written. Yet it was not imagined, but really happened, as we find it here as part of our Hometown Scrapbook. Thanks for listening.